Hello. This video is about how to define an interview. It's not meant to replace the reading we're going to do, but it's meant to supplement the reading we're going to do. All of these jobs involve interviewing. And as you've seen in our class, everyone wants to do an amazing variety of things with their lives and their jobs. All of these jobs, typically everyone you can think of, involves some type of interviewing. Journalist is a good example. Obviously, a journalist interviews someone in order to get a story. An attorney you can think of asking questions of a witness on a stand, in a courtroom, a police officer doing an investigation of a suspect, a recruiter trying to hire someone, but even a college recruiter trying to get an athlete to come be on their sports team. A healthcare professional trying to diagnose a patient, asking questions, trying to figure out what's wrong. Even a salesperson who's trying to sell someone a product, that's an interview situation as we define it. And as you'll see, let's look at the specific definition in the book. An interactional communication process between two parties, at least one of whom has a predetermined and serious purpose that involves the asking and answering of questions. Well, the easiest part of this is questions. An interview has to have these 5 elements, and questions is the easiest one. There's got to be questions asked. There's got to be a purpose. Remember, we have the RR and the EE. The interviewer typically, the RR always has a purpose, something they want out of the interview. But the EE typically has a purpose too. Think of a job interview. You're the EE, but you obviously have a purpose. You want to get the job. There's a process to the interview. That's what we're learning in this class, breaking it down into steps and learning how to do an interview. 2 parties, that's our interviewer, RR, and our interviewee, the EE. And then interactional, there's some sharing going back and forth. Interaction, that's what that means. So let's break this down a little bit more. And that way I'll be able to give you any situation, whether it's an interview or not, and you should be able to apply these 5 elements, essential elements of an interview, and tell me whether it is an interview or is not an interview. And then additionally, you should be able to tell me what type of interview it is. But we're not going to get to that in this video. We're just going to talk about the 5 elements. And this is an easy way, at least an easy way for me to remember the 5 elements of an interview. Q-tip. If you leave that last P off, it's the Q-tips you think of as a cotton swab. This is just, if you can think of the thing you stick in your ear to clean it, and you can. It's a quick way to remember the 5 elements of an interview. Let's take a look at them one by one. The Q in Q-tip is questions. Now, in order to be an interview, it's got to meet all 5 of these essential elements. You've got to have all 5 present. Questions, that's the easy one. There's got to be the asking of and the answering of questions in order for it to be an interview. Now, questions have all sorts of purposes besides just getting the answers. But typically we're trying to get data, we're trying to get something out of someone, maybe we're just trying to verify data or assumptions. But this is one you might not have thought about yet, provoke feelings. A lot of interviewers, therapists, counselors, maybe even a journalist who's trying to get a good soundbite, they use questions to provoke a reaction in the interviewee. So questions have all sorts of purposes, not just to get the answer. All right, let's look at the second part of this. We've got questions. There has to be 2 parties, and we've talked about this already in class. It's got to be an interviewer party and an interviewee party. You've got to be able to divide them in 2. In this case, this isn't an interview situation, although there's obviously questions going back and forth. You have that, but you don't really have the distinct 2 parties talking to each other about where to go for spring break. They're all in the same party. They're all equals. They're peers. But you throw in this, and maybe you don't know what a travel agent is, or that's sort of an antiquated term, but they're trying to book a cruise, so they go to a travel agent, and that brings it into 2 distinct parties. You've got the 4 college roommates who are in the one party, and the travel agent who's in the other. Maybe the travel agent is the interviewer asking questions of the roommates, trying to figure out what kind of cruise they would like to go on for spring break. But you've definitely now got 2 parties you can divide the groups into. Reporter talking to the chancellor of the university. There's one person in each party. The reporter is one person, in the interviewer party, and the chancellor is one person in the interviewee party. Doctor diagnosing patient, again, a one-on-one example. The doctor's the interviewer, the patient's the interviewee. You've got one person on each side, but it doesn't always have to be one-on-one. Example, a police officer pulls over a couple, suspects them of maybe speeding or something else in the car. The police officer's the interviewer. The couple becomes the interviewee, but there are two people in the interviewee party. A common scenario you're going to face is the hiring committee. Typically, people aren't interviewed by one person anymore. They're interviewed by a committee. So in this case, you have the interviewer party that's the committee of 2, maybe 3, maybe 4 people. It's still one party, even though there are 4 people in it. And then the person being interviewed, you, the interviewee, that's still one party. But here we have one person. Here we have 2, 3, 4, maybe even 5 people. So the number of people doesn't really matter in each party. What matters is that you can divide each party into a distinct group, either an interviewer group or an interviewee group. That's the key, is to have 2 parties. All right, let's go on to the third part of the Q-tip. Questions, 2 parties. The I is interactional. All this means is sharing. There's some sharing going on. This gives me a good chance to talk about the RR and the EE and the responsibilities that are shared, because there's some shared responsibilities that each person has. The RR has certain responsibilities in an interview. They have some responsibilities to do some research ahead of time, so it's not just a random interview. Prepare the questions, then actually ask the questions. That sounds silly, but sometimes it's really hard to ask really hard questions in an interview, really intimate questions. So you've got a responsibility as the interviewer to ask those hard questions. And then the RR has a responsibility of setting the EE at ease. Now the EE, the interviewee, the person being interviewed, has a set of responsibilities too. They have a responsibility to listen to the questions, to answer the questions and reply honestly. That's not always true, as we'll see a little bit later on. Maybe you're a PR representative and it's not the best thing to answer totally honestly for your client. Maybe an attorney the same way. But the RR and the EE share different responsibilities. Now, I think this is more what the book is getting at in the definition of interactional, of sharing. There are things that are shared back and forth. Feelings, motives, beliefs, information. There's something going back and forth between the interviewer and interviewee. And typically we think of the interviewee giving the interviewer all of this. The interviewer asks for questions about basic information, about whatever the interview is being conducted for. And the interviewee tells the stories or gives the data, whatever it is, back to the interviewer. But truthfully, it's a more dynamic and fluid process, and there's sharing going back and forth each way. This is what we call disclosure, and basically it means the more you share, the more the other person will share with you. And this is important for the interviewer to consider. When the interviewer opens up and shares and discloses, it allows the interviewee to do that also, to be more open to do that, and maybe more open to give you what you're looking for in the interviewer. It's not always true. Maybe you are the interviewers, the cops interviewing a suspect of a crime, and the suspect's guilty. Obviously, there's not going to be a lot of sharing going on in that case if you are guilty of the crime. Maybe you're a public relations representative speaking to reporters, so you're not going to completely be totally sharing and straightforward with what you want to provide if it's going to hurt your company. So there are situations where sharing does not go on, but in most interview situations it's a collaborative process, and there's a bunch of sharing going on, a bunch of interaction going on between the two parties of the interviewer. Purpose is kind of an easy one. Typically the interviewer has a definite purpose, a reason they're doing the interview. They want to get a sound bite for an article. They want to diagnose a patient. They want to discover if this person is a suspect in a crime. Whatever the situation is, the interviewer has something they want to get out of it. And the interviewee often has a purpose too in the interviewer, maybe to gain some publicity, maybe to prove that they're not guilty, maybe to land a job. But there's always some sort of serious purpose to the interview. That distinguishes it really from conversation. The last is process. There's a process, and this is what we're going to learn in this class, the process of the interviewer. It's not just random, but the interviewer has actually planned out what they're going to do, how they're going to do it, and when they're going to do it. And often the interviewee, who knows they're going to be interviewed ahead of time, there's a process they prepare for. Think about if you're going to do a job interview. You're going to plan out what you're going to answer, what your nonverbals are, what you're going to wear. There's a process to that on the interviewee side. So there's a process on both sides of the equation. So there's your Q-tip. There's your 5 elements. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You got to have all 5 present for it to be an interviewer. So let's look at this. A reporter asking students around campus about parking issues. Is it an interview? Well, there are questions. There are 2 parties, the journalist and the people they're interviewing. They're sharing. There's the answers to the questions coming back. There's a definite purpose. The reporters doing the interviews to get sound bites to use in their story, and the reporters using a definite process in how they're asking the questions. So yes, that's definitely an interviewer. Professor and a student talking about the firing of a chancellor. Is that an interview? Well, there may be questions. There may be 2 parties here. There may be sharing, but is there really a purpose? It depends if it's a chance encounter. If they just met and they're talking in the hallway, there's really no pre-planned purpose about it, and there's really no process. If they're just talking, it's just conversation. There's no planning or process to it. So it's not an interview. Meeting with a doctor, therapist, or counselor, these are all interview situations. Obviously, these are interviews. There's questions back and forth. There's definitely a separation between the healthcare professional, who's the interviewer, and the person being interviewed, the patient, the interviewee. They're sharing. There's definite purpose on both sides. One, the interviewee to get a diagnosis, the interviewer to give the diagnosis. And there's definitely a process to that, so yes. A student asking a professor to change a grade. Now this is an interesting one. We won't answer it here, but it's one to think about. Is there really planning a process that goes on when you go in to ask a professor to their office to ask them to change a grade? Is that an interview? How about a preacher giving a sermon? There's definitely 2 different parties here. There's the congregation, who's one party, the preacher, who's another party. There's definitely some sharing going back and forth. But is this an interview? A patient talking with a doctor about a surgery? Yes, this one's an interview for sure. 2 parties, questions going back and forth. The interviewees sharing some emotions, maybe some fears they have about the surgery. The doctor obviously has a process for assuring them and telling them what's going to happen. It's definitely an interview. President giving a speech on campus? How about that one? Is it an interview? So all this, thinking about the 5 parts of what an interview is and defining an interview, and a lot of this is about determining if you need to do an interview. An interview is expensive, it's time consuming. You don't always want to do an interview. Sometimes there are other options. You might want to do a questionnaire or an email or do a speech or do some research. There are cheaper ways to find what you need sometimes, but not always. All of this in Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 is about developing an awareness of the interview situation, of if it's an interview, and if so, what is the context or situation of that interview. And we're going to be talking more about that in Chapter 2. But I really wanted to focus on the 5 elements of the interview and make sure you understood that. Thanks a bunch.